The dust kicked up from the wagon wheels as it rolled down the narrow dirt path toward the Johnson ranch. Inside, 17-year-old Maria Santos clutched her few belongings in a torn cloth bag. Her dark eyes held a mixture of fear and determination that had kept her alive through months of hardship since her parents died in the cholera outbreak that swept through their small Mexican village. The man driving the wagon, Jake Morrison, was a slave trader who dealt in human cargo across the Texas border. He had promised Maria work as a house servant, but the iron shackles around her wrists told a different story. She was being sold, just like the dozen other young women he had transported over the past year. Thomas Johnson stood on his ranch porch, watching the approaching wagon with growing unease. At 32, he had built his cattle operation from nothing after the war ended. His weathered hands gripped the porch railing as he recognized Morrison's wagon. The rancher had been expecting a delivery of supplies, not whatever business Morrison was bringing to his door. Morrison pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down with a crooked grin. "Johnson! Good to see you again, partner. I got something special for you today." Thomas frowned. "I didn't order anything from you, Morrison. What's your business here?" "Now don't be so quick to turn away a good opportunity," Morrison said, walking to the back of the wagon. "I got me a fine piece of merchandise here. Young, strong, and real easy on the eyes. She'd make a fine addition to your ranch." When Morrison pulled back the canvas cover, Thomas saw Maria sitting in the wagon bed, her wrists bound and her clothes dirty from days of travel. Her eyes met his for just a moment, and he saw something in them that made his chest tighten with anger. "Get off my land," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Morrison laughed. "Come on now, Johnson, don't tell me you've gone soft. Every rancher needs help, and this one's already broken in. Won't give you no trouble." Thomas stepped down from the porch, his hand moving instinctively to the gun on his hip. "I said, get off my land. Now, you ain't even heard my price yet," Morrison pressed. $200 and she's yours. That's a bargain for what you're getting." The sound of Thomas drawing his gun was the only response Morrison got. The Colt revolver was steady in the rancher's hand, pointed directly at Morrison's chest. "You've got 10 seconds to unhitch that girl and get moving, or I'll put a bullet in you right here," Thomas said. His voice was calm, but his eyes blazed with fury. Morrison's face went pale. He had dealt with reluctant buyers before, but something about Johnson's expression told him this was different. This man would kill him without hesitation. "Now hold on," Morrison stammered, raising his hands. "There ain't no need for gunplay. We can work something out." 8 seconds, Thomas said. Morrison fumbled with the keys to Maria's shackles, his hands shaking as he unlocked them. "There, see? No harm done. The girl's free." Maria rubbed her wrists where the iron had chafed them raw. She looked between the two men, trying to understand what was happening. In her limited English, she had caught enough of the conversation to know she was being sold like livestock. But now the rancher had a gun pointed at her captor. "Get in that wagon and ride out," Thomas ordered Morrison. "If I ever see you on my land again, or if I hear you're still in this business, I'll hunt you down." Morrison climbed back onto the wagon seat, his face twisted with anger and fear. "This ain't over, Johnson. You just made yourself an enemy." "I'm counting on it," Thomas replied, keeping his gun trained on Morrison until the wagon disappeared over the hill. When the dust settled, Thomas holstered his weapon and turned to Maria. She stood beside the wagon, still clutching her small bag, uncertainty written across her face. She was smaller than he had first thought, probably not even 5 feet tall, but there was a strength in her posture that spoke of someone who had survived more than her share of hardship. "You speak English?" Thomas asked gently. Maria nodded slowly. "Little bit. My father teach me some. What's your name?"
"Maria Santos,"
she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas removed his hat and ran a hand through his sandy hair. He had acted on instinct when he saw Morrison trying to sell the girl, but now he was faced with the dilemma. Maria was clearly far from home with nowhere to go. He couldn't just send her away, but keeping her on his ranch would raise questions from his neighbors and could put them both in danger. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Maria's eyes lit up slightly, and she nodded. Thomas realized she was probably half-starved after days in Morrison's wagon. "Come on, then," he said, gesturing toward the ranch house. "Let's get you something to eat, and we'll figure out what to do next." The ranch house was modest but well-maintained. Thomas led Maria to the kitchen, where he put coffee on to brew and began preparing a simple meal of beans, bread, and bacon. Maria sat at the wooden table, watching him work with curious eyes. "Where are you from?" Thomas asked as he cooked. "Pueblo near Laredo," Maria replied. "My parents, they die from sickness. I tried to come north for work, but—" She gestured helplessly. "Morrison found you," Thomas finished. "See," he say, "he helped me find work," he lied. Thomas placed a plate of food in front of her and poured 2 cups of coffee. Maria ate hungrily, and he could see that she hadn't had a proper meal in days. "Maria," he said carefully, "you're safe now. Morrison won't bother you again, but I need you to understand something. If people around here find out what happened, it could mean trouble for both of us." Maria looked up from her food, confusion in her dark eyes. Thomas tried to explain. "Some folks around here, they don't take kindly to, well, to people helping someone like you. They might think I'm harboring stolen property or breaking some law." "I understand," Maria said quietly. I not make trouble for you." "No," Thomas said quickly. "That's not what I meant. I'm saying you can stay, but we need to be careful. As far as anyone else knows, I hired you to help around the ranch. You came here looking for work, and I gave you a job. That's the story we tell." Maria studied his face, trying to gauge whether she could trust this man who had just saved her from a terrible fate. Everything in his manner suggested honesty, but she had learned to be cautious. "Why you help me?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "I had a sister once. She was about your age when she died. Fever took her during the war. I guess I couldn't stand to see someone else's sister treated like property." The simple honesty in his words convinced Maria more than any elaborate explanation could have. She nodded slowly. "I work hard," she said. "I cook, I clean, I help with animals. I earn my place." "I'm sure you will," Thomas said. But first, tomorrow we'll talk about what needs doing around here." That evening, as Maria settled into the small but comfortable room Thomas had shown her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The rancher had asked for nothing in return for his help, and his manner had been respectful and kind. For the first time since her parents died, she felt like she might have found a place where she belonged. Meanwhile, Thomas sat on his porch, smoking his pipe and thinking about what he had gotten himself into. He knew Morrison wouldn't just disappear quietly. Men like that held grudges, and they had ways of making life difficult for people who crossed them. But looking back at the ranch house where a light glowed in Maria's window, he felt no regret about his decision. The next morning brought new challenges. Thomas's nearest neighbor, Bill Crawford, rode up just after sunrise with news that made Thomas's blood run cold. "Morrison was in town last night," Crawford said, dismounting from his horse. "He was telling anyone who'd listen that you stole something valuable from him. Said he's going to the sheriff about it." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "Morrison's a liar and a snake. Whatever he told you isn't true." "I figured as much," Crawford said. "But Tom, you need to know that some folks in town are listening to him. He's got friends, and they're not the kind of people you want as enemies." At that moment, Maria appeared from the kitchen, carrying a bucket to draw water from the well. Crawford's eyes widened as he took in her appearance. "Who's that?" he asked. "Maria Santos," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice casual. "She came looking for work yesterday. I hired her to help around the ranch." Crawford studied Maria as she worked, then looked back at Thomas with a knowing expression. "Tom, please tell me you didn't do what I think you did." "I hired a housekeeper," Thomas said firmly. "That's all there is to it. Morrison claims you stole a girl he was transporting. Says she's his property, bought and paid for. Morrison's full of horse manure," Thomas replied. "Maria came here on her own, looking for honest work. I gave her a job." Crawford shook his head. "I believe you, Tom, but the law might not see it that way. Sheriff Parker's riding out here this afternoon to ask questions. You better have your story straight. After Crawford left, Thomas found Maria in the kitchen preparing breakfast. He sat down across from her and explained what Crawford had told him. The sheriff's coming, he said. He's going to ask questions about how you came to be here. You need to tell him exactly what I told Crawford. You came here looking for work, and I hired you. Nothing about Morrison or what really happened. Do you understand? Maria's face went pale, but she nodded. I understand, but what if they not believe? They'll believe, Thomas said, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. Just stick to the story and everything will be fine. But as the morning wore on, Thomas began to worry that everything would not be fine. Morrison had friends in town, and some of them wore badges. If Sheriff Parker was inclined to believe Morrison's version of events, things could get very complicated very quickly. Around noon, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of visitors. Thomas stepped onto his porch to see Sheriff Parker riding up with 2 deputies and, to his dismay, Morrison himself. "Afternoon, Johnson," Sheriff Parker called out as he dismounted. He was a thin man with a gray mustache and cold eyes that missed nothing. "I believe you know why I'm here." "Can't say that I do, Sheriff," Thomas replied, though his hand remained close to his gun. "Morrison here claims you stole some property from him yesterday. Says you threatened him with a gun and made off with something valuable." Thomas looked directly at Morrison, who sat on his horse with a smug expression. "Morrison's a liar, Sheriff. He came onto my land uninvited yesterday, and I sent him away. That's the end of it. Where's the girl?" Morrison demanded. "I know you got her here somewhere." "I don't know what girl you're talking about," Thomas said. At that moment, Maria appeared in the doorway behind Thomas. She had heard the voices and come to see what was happening. When she saw Morrison, her face went white, but she forced herself to stand straight and meet the sheriff's gaze. "This her!" Morrison shouted, pointing at Maria. "That's the girl I was transporting. She's stolen property, Sheriff. I got papers on her." Sheriff Parker looked at Maria, then at Thomas. "Is this true, Johnson? Did you take this girl from Morrison?" "No, Sheriff," Thomas said calmly. "This is Maria Santos. She came to my ranch yesterday looking for work, and I hired her as my housekeeper. She's been nothing but helpful." "That's a lie," Morrison sputtered. "I had her in my wagon, bound and ready for delivery. Johnson pulled a gun on me and stole her." Sheriff Parker studied both men carefully. He had known Thomas Johnson for years and had never known him to lie, but Morrison's story was detailed and specific. The sheriff also knew about Morrison's business dealings, though they operated in a legal gray area that made prosecution difficult. "Maria," Sheriff Parker said, addressing her directly, "how did you come to be at Mr. Johnson's ranch?" Maria's heart pounded, but she remembered Thomas's instructions. In her careful English, she said, "I come looking for work. My parents dead, I need job. Mr. Johnson, he give me work." "She's lying!" Morrison shouted. "I transported her from Mexico. I got bills of sale." "Let me see these papers," Sheriff Parker said. Morrison fumbled in his coat and produced a wrinkled document. The sheriff examined it carefully, frowning as he read. "This here says you purchased a female slave named Rosa Martinez," the sheriff said. "It doesn't say anything about Maria Santos." Morrison's face reddened. That's an old paper. I got the right one back in town." "Convenient," Sheriff Parker said dryly. He looked at Maria again. "Miss Santos, has Mr. Morrison never transported you anywhere?" Maria met his eyes steadily. "No, senor. I never see this man before yesterday when he come to ranch." It was a careful lie, but Maria delivered it with conviction. She had indeed never seen Morrison before yesterday, in the sense that she was choosing to forget everything that happened before Thomas freed her. Sheriff Parker was quiet for a long moment, considering the situation. Finally, he turned to Morrison. "I don't see any evidence of theft here, Morrison. The girl says she came here looking for work, and Johnson says he hired her. Unless you can produce proper documentation proving ownership, I can't help you." "This is ridiculous," Morrison protested. "You know what my business is, Parker. You know I don't transport people for their health. What I know, Sheriff Parker said carefully, is that slavery was abolished over a decade ago. Whatever business you think you're in, it better be legal, or you'll be answering to a federal judge. The warning in the sheriff's voice was clear. Even if Morrison was telling the truth about transporting Maria, doing so for the purpose of selling her would be a federal crime. Parker wasn't about to get involved in that kind of trouble. Morrison realized he was beaten. With a snarl of rage, he spurred his horse and rode off, shouting threats over his shoulder about this not being over. Sheriff Parker watched him go, then turned back to Thomas. Johnson, I've known you for a long time, and I've never known you to be dishonest. But I'm going to give you some advice. Whatever really happened here yesterday, you best be careful. Morrison's got friends, and they don't forget grudges. I'll keep that in mind, Sheriff, Thomas said. After the lawmen left, Thomas and Maria stood in the sudden quiet of the ranch yard. The immediate crisis had passed, but both of them knew it wasn't over. They believed us, Maria said quietly. This time, Thomas replied. But Morrison's not going to give up. He'll be back, one way or another. As if to emphasize his point, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley. Thomas instinctively pushed Maria toward the house as he scanned the hills for signs of the shooter. A second shot kicked up dirt near the porch steps. Get inside, Thomas shouted, drawing his gun as he followed Maria into the house. From the kitchen window, they could see movement on the ridge overlooking the ranch. At least 3 men on horseback were positioned there, and one of them was clearly Morrison. Looks like he decided not to wait, Thomas muttered, checking his rifle. Maria, there's a root cellar behind the kitchen. I want you to get down there and stay put until this is over. No, Maria said, surprising him with the firmness in her voice. I not hide while you fight my battle. This isn't your battle, Thomas said. It's mine now. Is both, Maria replied. She moved to the kitchen and returned with a shotgun that had been hanging on the wall. My father, he teach me to shoot. Thomas looked at her with new respect. The frightened girl he had rescued was gone, replaced by someone ready to fight for her freedom. Another rifle shot shattered the front window, and Thomas made his decision. If Morrison wanted a fight, he would get one. The siege of the Johnson Ranch was about to begin. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Johnson Ranch as rifle fire continued to echo from the hills. Thomas crouched beneath the broken front window, counting muzzle flashes. 4 shooters, maybe 5, spread across the ridge in positions that gave them clear shots at the house and barn. Maria knelt beside the kitchen window, the shotgun steady in her small hands. She had tied her long dark hair back and rolled up her sleeves, transforming from a rescued victim into a determined defender. Every few minutes, one of Morrison's men would try to move closer to the house, and she would send a blast of buckshot in their direction to discourage the attempt. They're trying to pin us down until dark, Thomas called out to her. Morrison knows that once the sun goes down, they can get close enough to set fire to the house. How many bullets you have? Maria asked, reloading her shotgun with practiced efficiency. Thomas checked his ammunition belt. Maybe 30 for the rifle, another 12 for the handgun. You? 20 shells for shotgun. Is enough? Before Thomas could answer, a new voice called out from the ridge. Johnson, you hear me down there? Thomas recognized Morrison's voice, though the man was staying well hidden behind the rocks. I hear you, Morrison, Thomas shouted back. You got something that belongs to me, and I aim to get it back. Send the girl out, and we'll call it even. Go to hell, was Thomas's reply, followed by a rifle shot in Morrison's direction. The gunfire intensified after that. Morrison's men began shooting in coordinated volleys, trying to overwhelm the defenders. Bullets shattered what remained of the windows and chipped away at the wooden walls of the house. During a lull in the shooting, Maria noticed movement near the barn. Someone going to horses, she warned. Thomas saw it too. One of Morrison's men was working his way around the back of the property, probably planning to steal their horses and leave them stranded. Without mounts, they would be sitting ducks. I have to stop him, Thomas said, checking his gun. Is too dangerous, Maria protested. They shoot you before you get halfway to barn. If they get the horses, we're finished anyway, Thomas replied. He looked at her seriously. Maria, if something happens to me, there's a trail that leads north through the canyon behind the house. Follow it for about 5 miles and you'll reach the McBride Ranch. Tell them what happened, and they'll help you. Nothing happened to you, Maria said firmly. We both get out of this. Thomas smiled grimly. I hope you're right. He waited for another volley of shots from the ridge, then sprinted from the house toward the barn. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet as Morrison's men tried to track him, but he reached the relative safety of the barn wall without being hit. The horse thief was inside the barn, trying to saddle Thomas's best mare. He spun around when he heard footsteps going for the gun on his hip, but Thomas was faster. The rifle shot echoed in the confined space, and the man dropped without a sound. Thomas quickly checked on his horses, relieved to find them unharmed but spooked by the gunfire. He was about to head back to the house when he heard Maria's shotgun boom twice in quick succession, followed by shouting from the ridge. Racing back across the yard, Thomas burst through the kitchen door to find Maria reloading frantically. 2 of them try to rush house, she explained breathlessly. I stopped them, but they getting bold. Thomas could see the bodies of 2 men sprawled in the dirt between the house and the ridge. Morrison was down to maybe 3 men now, but that was still enough to cause serious trouble. As the afternoon wore on, the situation grew more desperate. Morrison's men had found better positions and were maintaining a steady rate of fire that made it impossible for Thomas or Maria to move freely around the house. They were running low on ammunition, and the walls of the old ranch house were beginning to show serious damage from the continuous shooting. We can't keep this up much longer, Thomas admitted during a brief lull. They've got us outnumbered and outgunned. Maybe help come, Maria suggested hopefully. Maybe, Thomas said, though he doubted it. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the sound of gunfire might not carry that far. They were on their own. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Thomas made a difficult decision. Maria, I want you to head for the McBride Ranch now while there's still light. Take my horse and ride hard. Don't look back. Not leave you, Maria said stubbornly. This isn't about bravery, Thomas said. It's about making sure Morrison doesn't get what he came for. If you stay here, you might get captured or killed. If you get away, then everything we've done today means something. Maria looked at him for a long moment, understanding the logic of his words but hating the choice they represented. What about you? I'll hold them off as long as I can, then follow the canyon trail on foot. Maybe I can make it to the McBrides before Morrison figures out you're gone. Before Maria could respond, a new sound reached their ears, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Both Thomas and Maria peered carefully through the windows, trying to see who was coming. More of Morrison's men? Maria asked. Thomas squinted at the dust cloud approaching from the east. No, he said slowly, a smile beginning to spread across his face. That's Bill Crawford, and it looks like he brought some friends. 6 riders came thundering up to the ranch house, dismounting quickly and taking cover behind whatever shelter they could find. Crawford scrambled up to the front porch and shouted through the broken window, Tom, you and the girl all right in there? We're fine, Bill, Thomas called back. What brought you out here? Heard the shooting from my place, Crawford replied. Figured you might need some help dealing with Morrison's boys. The arrival of reinforcements changed everything. Morrison's men found themselves outnumbered and outflanked, with Crawford's group positioned to cut off their retreat. The shooting from the ridge became sporadic as Morrison tried to figure out his next move. Morrison! Crawford shouted toward the hills. You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your guns and come out peaceful, or we'll come up there and get you. Then a white cloth appeared on the end of a rifle barrel, waving slowly back and forth. We're coming down, Morrison called out. Don't shoot! One by one, Morrison and his remaining men emerged from their positions on the ridge, hands raised and weapons dropped. They walked slowly down the hill, clearly defeated, and knowing they had no choice but to surrender. Thomas and Maria came out of the battered ranch house to meet their rescuers. Maria still carried the shotgun, and there was a new confidence in her bearing that spoke of someone who had proven herself in battle. Much obliged, Bill, Thomas said, shaking Crawford's hand. We were in a tight spot there. No trouble at all, Crawford replied. Besides, Morrison's been causing problems for decent folks around here for too long. About time someone put a stop to it. Morrison and his men were quickly disarmed and tied up. The slave trader's face was a mask of rage and defeat as he glared at Thomas and Maria. "This ain't over, Johnson," Morrison snarled. "I got friends in high places. They'll make sure you pay for this." "Your friends in high places better be real good lawyers," Crawford said. "Because attempted murder and kidnapping are federal crimes. You're going to prison for a long time." Sheriff Parker arrived just as the sun was setting, bringing with him a federal marshal who had been tracking Morrison's activities for months. The marshal was very interested in Morrison's operation and the names of his associates. "We've been building a case against Morrison's network for over a year," the marshal explained to Thomas. "Your testimony about what happened here will help us put several dangerous criminals behind bars." As Morrison and his surviving men were loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial prison, the slave trader made one last attempt to cause trouble. "That girl's still stolen property," he shouted. "I don't care what anybody says. She belongs to whoever paid for her." The federal marshal walked over to Morrison's wagon and looked him directly in the eye. "Mister, slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. Even if your story was true, which I doubt, buying and selling human beings is a federal crime. The only person going to prison here is you." With that, the wagon rolled away, taking Morrison out of their lives forever. As the crowd of rescuers and lawmen dispersed, Thomas and Maria found themselves alone again at the ranch. The house was damaged but still livable, and the immediate danger was over. "So what happens now?" Maria asked as they surveyed the bullet holes and broken windows. "Now we rebuild," Thomas said, "and we go on with our lives." "Our lives?" Maria asked, studying his face. Thomas realized what he had said and felt his cheeks redden slightly. "I mean, well, if you want to stay. I know this isn't exactly the quiet job you were looking for when you came here." Maria looked around at the damaged ranch house, then back at Thomas. Despite everything they had been through, or perhaps because of it, she felt more at home here than anywhere else she could remember. "I think I like this job," she said with a small smile. "Is never boring." Over the following weeks, word of the siege at the Johnson Ranch spread throughout the territory. The story of the rancher who had saved a young woman from slavery and then fought off her captors became legend in the saloons and general stores of every town within 100 miles. Some visitors came to the ranch out of curiosity, wanting to see the place where the famous gunfight had occurred. Others came offering help with repairs or just to show their respect for what Thomas had done. Maria found herself something of a celebrity as well. The story of the small Mexican woman who had fought alongside her rescuer captured people's imaginations. Several neighboring ranchers offered her employment, but she politely declined. She had found her place. As autumn approached, the Johnson Ranch was not only fully repaired, but expanded. Thomas had used the insurance money from the damage to add a proper guest room and enlarge the kitchen. The ranch was more prosperous than ever, with several successful cattle drives bringing in good money. One evening, as Thomas and Maria sat on the newly rebuilt front porch, she asked him a question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Thomas, when you first see me in Morrison's wagon, why you help? You not know me. You risk everything." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and red. "I told you about my sister," he said finally. "See, the fever during the war. What I didn't tell you was how she died," Thomas continued. "She wasn't killed by fever. She was attacked by soldiers. Union soldiers who were supposed to be protecting civilians. They treated her like she was property, like she wasn't even human." Maria's eyes widened with understanding and sympathy. "I wasn't there to help her," Thomas said. "I was off fighting in some useless battle while my sister needed me. When I saw you in that wagon, I guess I saw a chance to do what I should have done for her." "I'm sorry about your sister," Maria said softly. "Her name was Sarah," Thomas said. "She would have liked you. She always stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Finally, Maria spoke again. "Thomas, I want to ask you something, but I'm not sure how to say it in English." "Just try," he encouraged. "In my country, when a man save a woman's life and when they fight together like we do, sometimes she struggled for the words, sometimes they become more than friends." Thomas felt his heart begin to race, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "What are you trying to say, Maria?" "I think maybe I fall in love with you," she said quietly, not looking at him. "But I not know if you feel same way, or if you just feel sorry for me." Thomas reached over and gently took her hand. "Maria, I haven't felt sorry for you since the first time I saw you pick up that shotgun. And yes, I feel the same way. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for weeks." Maria finally looked at him, her dark eyes shining in the starlight. "Really? Really?" Thomas confirmed, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. The autumn wedding of Thomas Johnson and Maria Santos was the social event of the season in their corner of Texas. People came from 3 counties to attend, including Sheriff Parker, Bill Crawford, and even the federal marshal who had arrested Morrison. Maria wore a white dress that the ladies of the nearby town had sewn for her, and Thomas wore his best suit with a new shirt that Maria had made for him. The ceremony was conducted by a traveling preacher on the front porch of the ranch house, with the repaired walls and new windows gleaming in the afternoon sunshine. As they exchanged vows, both Thomas and Maria thought about the strange path that had brought them together. What had started as one of the darkest moments of Maria's life had somehow led to the happiest day either of them could remember. But even as they celebrated, neither of them could have imagined the new challenges that awaited them, or how their love would be tested by forces they never saw coming. The winter of 1878 was harsh, but inside the Johnson ranch house, warmth and contentment prevailed. Maria had transformed the modest home into something that felt truly lived in and loved. Her cooking filled the house with wonderful aromas, and her laughter had brought life to rooms that had been silent for too long. Thomas found himself happier than he had ever thought possible. Coming home from long days working with the cattle to find Maria waiting for him with a hot meal and a warm smile made all the hardships of ranch life seem worthwhile. But their peaceful existence was about to be shattered by an unexpected visitor. It was a cold February morning when the knock came at their door. Thomas opened it to find a well-dressed Mexican man in his 50s, wearing an expensive coat and carrying an ornate walking stick. Behind him stood 2 younger men who were clearly bodyguards. "Senor Johnson," the man said in accented but perfect English, "I am Don Carlos Santos. I believe you know my daughter." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Behind him, he heard Maria gasp and drop the coffee cup she had been carrying. It shattered on the floor, but no one paid attention to the broken pieces. "Papa," Maria whispered, stepping forward in disbelief. Don Carlos's stern expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "Hello, my little flower. I have been searching for you for over a year." Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process this development. Maria had told him her parents died in a cholera outbreak, yet here was her father, very much alive and clearly wealthy. I thought you were dead," Maria stammered. "The sickness in the village." "I was away on business when the outbreak occurred," Don Carlos explained. "When I returned, I found our house empty and was told you had fled north. I have been searching for you ever since." Thomas finally found his voice. "Maria told me you had died." Don Carlos looked at him with cold eyes. "Perhaps my daughter told you what she wished to believe. You see, Senor Johnson, Maria and I had disagreements before she left home." "What kind of disagreements?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "I had arranged a marriage for her," Don Carlos replied. "A very advantageous marriage to the son of a wealthy landowner." Maria was resistant to the idea. "So you ran away," Thomas said to Maria, understanding beginning to dawn. Maria nodded miserably. "I could not marry him, Thomas. He was old and cruel, and I knew I would die if I became his wife. So I run away, but Morrison, he find me." Don Carlos studied Thomas carefully. "And you are the man who saved her from Morrison's clutches?" "I am," Thomas said. straightening his shoulders. For that I am grateful, Don Carlos said formally. But now I must take my daughter home. Her betrothal still stands, and her future husband has been very patient. No, Thomas said firmly. Maria is my wife now. We were married last autumn. Don Carlos's face darkened. Without my permission, without proper negotiations between our families, with love, Thomas replied simply, and that's the only permission we needed. One of Don Carlos's bodyguards stepped forward, his hand moving toward his gun, but the older man raised his walking stick to stop him. You are very bold, Senor Johnson, Don Carlos said. But you have no idea who you are dealing with. I own more land than you could ride across in a week. I have connections to the government in Mexico City and to powerful men on this side of the border as well. I don't care if you own half of Mexico, Thomas replied. Maria made her choice, and she chose me. Papa, Maria said, stepping forward. Please, try to understand. I am happy here. Thomas is a good man, and I love him. Love, Don Carlos said, dismissively. You are a child playing at being a woman. What do you know of love? What do you know of responsibility to your family? I know that real love doesn't force someone into a marriage they don't want, Maria replied, showing a strength that surprised even Thomas. Don Carlos was quiet for a moment, studying his daughter's face. When he spoke again, his voice was softer but somehow more menacing. Maria, you will come home with me today. This foolish adventure is over. She's not going anywhere, Thomas said, moving to stand beside his wife. Actually, Don Carlos said with a cold smile, she is. You see, I have brought more than just these two men with me. There are 20 armed vaqueros positioned around your ranch right now. If you attempt to prevent me from taking my daughter, they will burn this place to the ground with you inside it. As if to emphasize the point, Thomas could see armed men emerging from positions around the ranch buildings. They had been completely surrounded without knowing it. You can't just take her, Thomas protested. She's a grown woman, and she's my wife. Your marriage is not valid, Don Carlos said. It was performed without my consent, which means it has no legal standing in Mexico. And since Maria is a Mexican citizen, Mexican law applies to her. We're in Texas, Thomas pointed out. Are we? Don Carlos asked with an unpleasant smile. I have friends in the territorial government, Senor Johnson. Friends who owe me many favors. If necessary, I can make your life here very difficult indeed. Thomas realized he was trapped. He could fight, but against 20 men, the outcome was certain. Even if he managed to take some of them down, Maria would still be captured, and he would be dead. What do you want? Thomas asked finally. I want my daughter to come home and fulfill her obligations to her family, Don Carlos said. As for you, you will sign a document renouncing any claim to marriage with Maria, and you will never attempt to contact her again. And if I refuse, then you will be killed, resisting arrest on charges of kidnapping a Mexican citizen. My friends in the government will be very understanding about the need to use force in such circumstances. Maria looked back and forth between her father and her husband, tears streaming down her face. She could see that Thomas was ready to fight, even knowing it meant his death, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing him. I'll go, she said quietly. Maria, no, Thomas said immediately. I won't let you die for me, Maria replied. I've lost too many people I love already. Your daughter is wise, Senor Johnson, Don Carlos said. She understands the reality of the situation. But I have one condition, Maria said, surprising everyone. Don Carlos frowned. You are in no position to make conditions. If I go with you, you must give me your word that Thomas will not be harmed. Not now, not ever. You will not use your influence to destroy his ranch or make trouble for him. Maria, her father said impatiently, you cannot dictate terms to me. Then shoot me now, Maria said calmly, because I will not go with you knowing that Thomas will suffer for loving me. The bold statement caught Don Carlos off guard. He had expected tears and pleading, not this quiet determination. Thomas stared at his wife in amazement. Even facing her powerful father and his armed men, Maria was still fighting for him. "Very well," Don Carlos said finally. "I give you my word that your husband will not be harmed, provided he signs the renouncement papers and makes no attempt to follow you or contact you, and provided he does not interfere with your family's business," one of the bodyguards added. Don Carlos nodded. Yes, that as well. Thomas felt like his world was crumbling around him. "Maria, there has to be another way." "There is no other way," Maria said sadly. She reached up and touched his face gently. "But remember what you told me about your sister. You said she would have liked me because I stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that someday, maybe I find a way to stand up for myself," Maria said quietly, so only Thomas could hear. The hope in her voice was so faint that Thomas almost missed it, but it was there, and it told him that she hadn't given up entirely. The next hour was the most painful of Thomas's life. He signed the papers that Don Carlos's men produced, legally renouncing his marriage to Maria. He watched as Maria packed her few belongings, trying to memorize every detail of her face for what might be the last time. As the group prepared to leave, Maria managed to speak to Thomas privately for just a moment. "The old oak tree by the creek," she whispered urgently. "If there's ever a way, I'll leave a message there." Before Thomas could respond, she was being helped into an ornate carriage that had been brought up from the road. Don Carlos and his men mounted their horses, and the entire group departed, leaving Thomas standing alone in his ranch yard. For weeks after Maria's departure, Thomas barely functioned. He went through the motions of caring for his cattle and maintaining the ranch, but his heart wasn't in it. The house felt empty and cold without Maria's presence. He checked the oak tree by the creek every day, but there was never a message. As spring turned to summer, he began to fear that he would never see his wife again. Then, in late July, everything changed. Thomas was mending fence near the creek when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. He looked up to see a lone rider coming toward him at full gallop. As the figure got closer, he realized it was a woman wearing men's clothes and riding like her life depended on it. It was Maria. She practically fell off the horse as she reached him, and Thomas caught her in his arms. She was thinner than he remembered, and there were new lines of worry around her eyes. But she was alive, and she was here. "Maria, how did you... what happened?" "Later," she gasped, still catching her breath from the hard ride. "We don't have much time. My father thinks I'm visiting relatives in Guadalajara. I have maybe 3 days before he discovers I'm gone." 3 days, Thomas said, hardly believing she was real. "Then what?" "Then I disappear forever," Maria said. "Thomas, I can't go back. The man my father wants me to marry, he's worse than I thought. Much worse." She told him about the past few months, how she had been kept virtually as a prisoner in her father's house while preparations for her wedding continued. Her intended husband, Ricardo Vasquez, had visited several times, and each visit had convinced her that marriage to him would be a living nightmare. "He has already killed 2 wives, Maria said quietly. "Everyone knows it, but he's too powerful for anyone to do anything about it." "Then we'll leave," Thomas said immediately. "We'll go somewhere your father can't find us." "Where?" Maria asked. "He has connections everywhere in the Southwest. And besides, what about your ranch? You worked so hard for this place." "The ranch doesn't matter without you," Thomas said. "We'll go to California or Oregon, somewhere far enough away that even your father's influence can't reach." "It won't be easy," Maria warned. "He'll never stop looking for me. And Ricardo, if he finds out I've run away again, he'll want revenge." "Let him try," Thomas said grimly. "I won't lose you twice." They spent the next 2 days making frantic preparations. Thomas sold his cattle to a neighbor for less than they were worth but got cash immediately. He packed only what they could carry on horseback and arranged for Bill Crawford to look after the ranch until he could return or send for his belongings. On the morning of the 3rd day, they set out for California, taking a route through the mountains that would make them harder to track, but their escape had not gone unnoticed. They had been riding for about 6 hours when Thomas spotted the dust cloud behind them. A large group of riders was following their trail, and they were gaining ground fast. "They found us," Thomas said grimly. Maria looked back at the approaching riders. "How many?" "Too many," Thomas replied. "We need to find somewhere to make a stand." They pushed their horses harder, looking for defensible ground. Finally, they found a narrow canyon with steep walls on both sides. It wasn't perfect, but it would force their pursuers to come at them from only one direction. Thomas helped Maria down from her horse and checked his weapons. He had his rifle, his pistol, and about 50 rounds of ammunition. It wasn't much against what looked like 20 or more men. "Maria, there's a cave back in those rocks," he said, pointing toward the rear of the canyon. "I want you to hide there until this is over." "We've been through this before," Maria said firmly. "I don't hide while you fight for both of us." She was carrying a rifle she had taken from her father's house, and Thomas could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't the same frightened girl he had rescued from Morrison's wagon. The months of captivity had hardened her, and she was ready to fight for her freedom. The riders reached the mouth of the canyon just as the sun was beginning to set. Thomas was surprised to see that Don Carlos himself was leading the group, along with Ricardo Vasquez and what looked like a small army of vaqueros. "Maria," Don Carlos called out, "you have led us on a fine chase, my daughter, but it ends here." "It doesn't have to end in bloodshed," Thomas shouted back. "Just let us go, and nobody gets hurt." "To you have stolen my daughter twice now, gringo," Don Carlos replied. "This time there will be consequences." Ricardo Vasquez spurred his horse forward. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s with cruel eyes and a scar across one cheek. "Give me the woman," Ricardo called out, "and I will make your death quick." "Go to hell," was Thomas's response, followed by a rifle shot that knocked Ricardo's hat off his head. The battle for the canyon began immediately. Don Carlos's men spread out across the canyon mouth and began a coordinated attack. Thomas and Maria took cover behind the rocks and returned fire, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. As the fight continued, Thomas realized they couldn't win. They might take some of their attackers with them, but the outcome was inevitable. Then, just as he was beginning to despair, he heard something that made his heart leap with hope, the sound of more hoofbeats coming from behind their attackers. A new group of riders charged into the canyon, catching Don Carlos's men completely by surprise. Thomas recognized the lead rider immediately. It was the federal marshal who had arrested Morrison, along with a dozen deputy marshals. The arrival of federal law enforcement changed everything. Don Carlos's men found themselves caught in crossfire, and several of them threw down their weapons immediately rather than risk being shot. "This is Deputy Marshal Williams," the lead rider called out. "Everyone put down your weapons, now." The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had started. Don Carlos sat on his horse in the middle of the canyon, his face a mask of rage and frustration. "Marshal Williams," Thomas called out, emerging from cover. "Good to see you again." "Johnson," the marshal replied with a grin. "You seem to have a talent for getting into trouble with the wrong people. How did you find us?" Maria asked, also coming out of hiding. "We've been tracking Don Carlos for months," Williams explained. "He's wanted on federal charges for kidnapping and human trafficking. When we heard he had crossed the border again, we followed him." Don Carlos's face went pale. "I am a Mexican citizen. You have no authority over me." "Actually, we do," Williams said, producing a set of documents. "These are extradition papers signed by both governments. You're wanted for crimes on both sides of the border." As the deputy marshals began rounding up Don Carlos's men, Williams approached Thomas and Maria. "I'm sorry about what happened to you folks," he said, "but this should put an end to your troubles. Don Carlos and his organization are finished." Ricardo Vasquez, who had been wounded in the shooting, was loaded into a wagon along with several other prisoners. As they prepared to leave, he glared at Maria with hatred. "This isn't over, puta," he snarled. "I have friends who will find you." "No," Williams said calmly. "It really is over. You're going to prison for a very long time, assuming you live long enough to stand trial." As the prisoners were led away, Don Carlos looked at his daughter one last time. "You are no daughter of mine," he said coldly. "You are dead to me. I was dead to you the moment you tried to sell me like a piece of property," Maria replied with dignity. "Goodbye, Papa." With that, the chapter of her old life closed forever. 3 months later, Thomas and Maria stood on a hill overlooking their new ranch in Northern California. The federal government had compensated them for their troubles with Don Carlos, and they had used the money to buy land in a valley where nobody knew their history. The ranch was smaller than the one in Texas, but it was theirs free and clear, and it represented a fresh start for both of them. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Regret what?" Maria replied. "Leaving everything you knew, your family, your country, your old life." Maria thought about it seriously before answering. "My real life started the day you saved me from Morrison's wagon," she said finally. "Everything before that was just preparation." Thomas smiled and put his arm around his wife's shoulders. "I love you, Maria Johnson." "I love you too, Thomas Johnson," she replied. "And this time nobody's going to take me away from you." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they walked back toward their house together. Behind them, the lights of a growing town twinkled in the valley, and ahead of them lay a future full of possibilities. The girl who had once been sold like property had found her freedom, and the rancher who had risked everything to save her had found his purpose. Together, they had built something that no amount of money or power could ever destroy. A love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever. In the years that followed, the Johnson Ranch became famous throughout California for the quality of its cattle and the kindness of its owners. Thomas and Maria raised 4 children who grew up hearing the story of how their parents met and fell in love. The children never tired of the tale, especially the parts about their mother's courage in defending the ranch and their father's determination to protect the woman he loved. Local newspapers eventually picked up the story, and it was retold and embellished until it became part of the folklore of the American West. But those who knew the real Thomas and Maria Johnson understood that no embellishment was necessary. The truth was remarkable enough. Maria never saw her father again. News reached them years later that he had died in a Mexican prison, still defiant to the end. Ricardo Vasquez had met a similar fate, killed by another prisoner who had been motivated by nothing more than personal dislike. Sometimes, when Thomas and Maria sat on their porch in the evening, watching their children play in the yard, they would talk about the strange chain of events that had brought them together. A slave trader's greed, a rancher's conscience, and a young woman's courage had combined to create a love story that would be remembered long after both of them were gone. "Do you think it was all meant to happen?" Maria would sometimes ask. "I don't know about meant to happen," Thomas would reply, "but I know it all worked out the way it was supposed to. And on those peaceful evenings, surrounded by the life they had built together, that seemed like answer enough."